In the Whitford household, there was a silent price to be paid for belonging, one that was measured in the steady, invisible erosion of Lynn's own history. Every habit she had brought from her home in Vietnam had been gently, politely scraped away like dried mud off an expensive shoe. Her gestures, her language, and even the tiny bottle of jasmine oil she once kept in her cabinet had been replaced by the approved, sterile fragrances of a world that viewed her very presence as a compromise. She had learned to move like a shadow, to anticipate their preferences before they became demands, and to keep her thoughts locked behind an unchanging smile. To them, her labor was as natural as running water, consumed without a second thought. On this quiet Sunday afternoon, as the rest of the family rested, she stood over the cold quartz counter, her fingers already raw from a long list of invisible chores that never truly ended. The pink silver polish had a chemical, sweet scent that always clung to the back of Lynn's throat long after she finished. She dipped the soft flannel cloth into the small tub, lifting a tiny smear of the paste, and began to work it into the ornate handle of the teapot. It was a heavy piece, sterling silver, passed down through 3 generations of Thomas's family. The metal was cold in her hands, resisting the warmth of her palms. With steady, rhythmic circles, she rubbed. The silver blackened under the cloth, a dark, greasy smudge that revealed the bright, mirror-like surface beneath. This was her Sunday routine. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked, a heavy, hollow thud that echoed through the high ceilings of the house. It was 5 minutes fast. Richard, her father-in-law, insisted on keeping it that way. He claimed it kept the household sharp, preventing anyone from falling into what he called passive habits. Lynn's lower back ached from leaning over the kitchen island. The white quartz countertop was pristine, reflecting the bright, recessed, light-emitting diode lights overhead. To her left, the baby monitor hummed with a low, static hiss. Leo was asleep upstairs, his quiet, rhythmic breathing occasionally breaking through the white noise. She treasured these quiet hours, though they were never truly empty. There was always something to clean, something to prepare, some small detail that required her touch to keep the house running according to the unspoken rules of the Whitford family. A soft squeak sounded from the hallway. Eleanor entered the kitchen, her steps light and measured. She wore her usual Sunday uniform of a beige cashmere cardigan, tailored trousers, and soft-soled house shoes. She stopped near the island, her eyes immediately scanning the surface. She did not look at Lynn directly. Instead, her gaze lingered on the silver tea service, then moved to the small bowl of jasmine tea Lynn had brewed for herself. "Oh, Lynn, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice soft and melodic, carrying that practiced gentleness that always made Lynn feel as though she were being handled by a delicate glove. "You are using the flannel? I always find the microfiber cloths we keep in the pantry preserve the shine much better. The flannel can be so abrasive on the older engraving." Lynn looked down at the cloth in her hand. It was the exact flannel cloth Eleanor had handed her 3 months ago, insisting it was the only proper tool for the job. The urge to mention this rose in Lynn's throat, warm and sharp. She calculated the energy it would take to explain. If she reminded Eleanor, Eleanor would smile, look slightly confused, and then spend 10 minutes explaining the history of her family's silver preservation methods. It would end with Eleanor saying, "Well, of course, you do things differently where you are from, but we like to be careful here." Lynn adjusted her grip, hiding the gray stain of the silver polish under her thumb. "The microfiber is in the pantry, then?" she asked quietly. "Yes, dear, in the basket marked linens. It is just that Richard likes the tea service to be perfect for tomorrow. You know how he gets when his associates are over." Eleanor picked up the small bowl of jasmine tea, sniffed it slightly, and placed it back down a few inches away from its original spot. "By the way, I noticed some fresh ginger in the crisper drawer, that very strong, earthy kind." Lynn kept her eyes on the teapot handle. "I bought it yesterday." "Of course," Eleanor said, smoothing the front of her cardigan. "It is just that Richard's stomach has been so terribly sensitive lately, and that heavy, pungent smell has a way of clinging to the curtains in the dining room. We have the carpet cleaners coming next week, and I would hate for them to have to do double the work. I thought we agreed we would stick to the classic pot roast for tomorrow night. Simple, clean flavors." The ginger was not for dinner. Lynn had developed a dry, persistent cough 3 days ago. She had been drinking ginger and honey tea in the late hours of the night, long after the rest of the house was asleep, sitting in the dark kitchen so she would not disturb anyone. "I will keep it in the bag," Lynn said. "It won't leave the fridge." "Thank you, sweetheart," Eleanor said, patting Lynn's shoulder. The touch was brief, dry, and cool. "We just want everything to feel fresh and inviting. A clean home is so important, isn't it?" Before Lynn could answer, a loud, sharp voice drifted from the living room. "Lynn, where is the charger for the tablet? Leo's screen is at 2%, and he is going to wake up cranky if he doesn't have his show." Thomas stepped into the kitchen doorway. He was wearing his gray fleece pullover, his hair slightly rumpled from lying on the sofa. He did not look at Lynn. His eyes were glued to his phone as he scrolled through a work email. "It is in the entryway drawer, Thomas," Lynn said. "I looked," Thomas muttered, his thumb moving rapidly over his screen. "It is not there." "I checked the top drawer." "It is in the second drawer, behind the key basket," Lynn said, her voice flat, devoid of any rising frustration. "Can you just grab it? I am in the middle of this email from the firm," Thomas said, his tone casual, carrying the absolute certainty that his time was more valuable than hers. He turned and walked back toward the living room without waiting for a reply. Lynn sat still for a moment. The silver teapot sat before her, half polished, one side shining with a brilliant artificial light, the other side dull, gray, and tarnished. She could stay seated. She could tell Thomas she was in the middle of polishing his mother's family heirloom. But the back and forth would disrupt the quiet of the afternoon. Eleanor was still standing by the refrigerator, watching her with a mild, expectant gaze. Lynn set the flannel cloth down on the quartz counter. She stood up, her joints popping slightly in the silence of the kitchen. "I will find it," Lynn said to the empty doorway. As she walked past Eleanor, she caught a whiff of her mother-in-law's perfume, lavender and expensive powder, mixed with the sharp chemical sting of the silver polish. It was a combination that always made her head ache. She walked into the quiet hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood floor. The grandfather clock ticked, louder here, a steady, relentless reminder of the time slipping away, minute by minute, in a house that felt less like a home and more like a beautifully decorated museum where she was the only curator. The second drawer of the dark mahogany console table in the entryway opened with a quiet, oiled glide. Inside, a silver-plated basket held various key rings, plastic loyalty cards, and a small stack of unopened mail addressed to Resident. Directly behind the basket lay the white charger cord, coiled neatly. It was partially covered by a pair of Thomas's leather driving gloves and 3 crumpled golf scorecards from the previous weekend. Lynn picked up the cord. She felt the cool, smooth plastic of the wire. Thomas had not even pulled the drawer open halfway. Had he done so, the white cord would have been fully visible against the dark wood. She stood there for a brief second, the static electricity from the thick wool runner beneath her feet prickling the soles of her socks. She could call out to him. She could bring the drawer to his attention, show him that his own misplaced items had hidden the charger. She calculated the mental energy required for the conversation. Thomas would defend himself by saying he was stressed about work, or he would laugh it off with a quick, dismissive comment about how she always knew where things were anyway. Either path required her to speak, to explain, to invite his defensive posture. She chose to slide the drawer shut, the wood meeting the frame with a soft, expensive click. She walked back into the living room. Thomas was still on the sofa, his knees spread wide, his gaze fixed on his phone. The television was playing a recorded golf tournament. The green of the fairway filled the large screen, and the announcer spoke in low, hushed tones that sounded like a collective whisper in an empty church. Lynn held out the charger. Thomas reached up and took it without looking at her. His eyes remained on the screen of his phone, where a spreadsheet was open. "Thanks," he muttered, his thumb scrolling. "Did you happen to see my sunglasses while you were in there?" "Where did you leave them?" Lynn asked. "If I knew that, Lynn, I wouldn't be asking," he said. His voice was not angry, just flat, carrying that casual, polite dismissiveness that characterized most of their conversations. He plugged the charger into his phone and then into the outlet behind the side table, his shoulder blocking her out of his field of vision. "I will look for them when I finish in the kitchen," Lynn said. Thomas did not reply. He simply tapped his screen, the blue light reflecting in his eyes. Lynn returned to the kitchen. Eleanor was still there, now holding a dry microfiber cloth, polishing the silver tray that Lynn had already wiped down. Eleanor did not say anything, but her action was clear. She was checking the work, correcting the invisible flaws that only she could see. The heavy thud of a car door closing outside broke the silence. A moment later, the grumble of the automatic garage door opener vibrated through the floorboards. Richard was home. The door from the garage to the mudroom opened, and Richard walked in. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with thick, silver-white hair combed straight back. He smelled of the cold, damp autumn air and the leather upholstery of his luxury sedan. He carried a leather briefcase, which he set precisely on the bench in the mudroom before stepping into the kitchen. He did not look at Lynn. He walked straight to Eleanor, planting a brief, dry kiss on her cheek. "Cold out there," Richard said, rubbing his hands together. "Is the heat on? It feels drafty in here. Did someone leave the patio door unlatched again?" Lynn washed her hands at the sink. The warm water felt good on her raw, dry skin. The lemon-scented dish soap was strong, but beneath it she could still smell the chemical tang of the silver polish. "The patio door is locked, Richard. Lynn said, keeping her voice even as she dried her hands on a kitchen towel. "I checked it after lunch." "Well, there is a draft," Richard said, his tone clipped. He walked past her to the thermostat on the wall, his leather-soled shoes clicking sharply on the hardwood. He tapped the digital screen several times, raising the temperature by 2 degrees. "We can't have the house losing heat. It is inefficient." Eleanor set the silver tray down on the island. "Richard is right, dear. We must be mindful of the doors. Obviously, with the wind coming off the ridge today. Now, about dinner tomorrow night. Have you started prepping the vegetables for the pot roast?" Lynn reached into the lower cabinet and pulled out a large brown paper bag of russet potatoes. "I was about to start them." "Good," Eleanor said, nodding. "Remember to cut them smaller this time. Richard likes them to melt into the gravy. When they are too large, they stay quite firm in the center, and he finds them difficult to manage." Lynn set the potatoes on the counter. She pulled a sheet of yesterday's newspaper from the recycling bin and spread it over the quartz surface to catch the dirt. She took a vegetable peeler from the drawer. The potatoes were cold and dusty. As she scraped the peeler against the first potato, the brown, earthy skin curled away, revealing the pale, wet flesh beneath. The smell of cold earth filled the small space around her, a brief, grounding contrast to the artificial lavender and chemical polish that dominated the kitchen. She worked in silence. Richard stood by the island, leafing through the mail Eleanor had left there, while Eleanor adjusted the kitchen window blinds to let in the dimming afternoon light. Neither of them spoke to Lynn, yet their presence was heavy, a pair of silent observers measuring the speed of her hands, the size of the potato peels, the quietness of her movements. Lynn calculated the hours left in the day. It was 4 in the afternoon. After the potatoes, she would have to prep the carrots and onions. Then she would have to make a light dinner for tonight, wash the dishes, put Leo to bed, and clean the kitchen again to ensure it was pristine for the morning. She would not sit down until 10 tonight. The scrap of the peeler against the potato was the only sound in the kitchen, a sharp, repeating rhythm that seemed to measure the slow, steady erosion of her day. The hum of the kitchen exhaust fan was a steady, vibrating drone that filled the quiet house. It was a high-end, commercial-grade system installed during Eleanor's kitchen remodel 3 years ago, designed to suck every trace of cooking odor out of the room before it could reach the dining area. Lynn stood beneath it, watching the blue flames of the gas stove flicker as the water in the stainless steel pot began to show tiny, silent bubbles along the bottom. She was preparing Sunday night's dinner. It was always a simple, neutral meal, a quiet prelude to the busy week. Tonight, it was baked chicken breasts, steamed broccoli, and white rice. No spices, no rich sauces, no lingering aromas. It was the kind of food Eleanor referred to as safe, a word she used often to describe everything from paint colors to neighborhood schools. Lynn picked up a head of broccoli. The green florets were dense and cold against her fingers. She held it under the stream of cold tap water, watching the droplets bead and roll off the tightly packed buds. The water ran over her wrists, chilly and numbing, but she did not turn the dial to warm. The physical discomfort was a distraction, a way to anchor herself in the present moment while the quiet machinery of the Whitford home operated around her. From the baby monitor on the counter, A soft, waking whimper broke through the static. Leo was stirring. Lynn turned off the tap, her hand moving instinctively toward the towel to dry her hands so she could go upstairs. Before she could take a step, Eleanor's light voice sounded from the doorway. "I will get him, dear," Eleanor said, already moving toward the stairs. "You have your hands full with the dinner. I can hear Richard's stomach rumbling from the den. We don't want to be late." Lynn's hand hovered over the cotton towel. She had not yet dried her skin. She calculated the energy required to insist on going herself. Leo was her son. He had a specific way he liked to be lifted from his crib when he first woke up. A gentle, slow scoop that kept him from being startled. But if she argued, Eleanor would offer a gentle, pitying smile and say she was only trying to help her tired daughter-in-law. It would become a discussion about Lynn's stress levels, which would inevitably lead to Thomas chiming in from the living room. Lynn lowered her hand. "Of course," she said quietly. "Thank you, Eleanor." She turned back to the cutting board. She picked up the heavy chef's knife. The blade was sharp, slicing through the thick, woody stem of the broccoli with a clean, satisfying crunch. She cut the head into uniform florets, placing them into the metal steamer basket. Thomas entered the kitchen, his bare feet making no sound on the floor. He walked past her to the refrigerator, opened the double doors, and stood in the cool yellow light, searching the shelves. He pulled out a bottle of sparkling water, popped the cap with a silver opener on the counter, and took a long drink. "Is dinner almost ready?" Thomas asked, his eyes scanning his phone again. "I have to jump on a prep call for the Tokyo merger at 7. It will be about 20 minutes, Lynn said, keeping her eyes on the cutting board. "The chicken is just going into the oven." Thomas sighed, a short, sharp puff of air. "Okay, try to keep it moving. I can't be late for this call. It is with the senior partners." Lynn did not point out that she had started dinner at the exact time they had agreed upon. She did not mention that if he had helped her wash the vegetables or set the table, the process would be faster. Instead, she reached for the baking sheet. She placed the 3 pale chicken breasts onto the metal tray. She seasoned them with a tiny pinch of salt and an even smaller pinch of black pepper. She had to be careful with the pepper. Richard claimed it irritated his sinuses, and even a visible speck on his plate could prompt a 10-minute lecture on domestic hygiene and food preparation. She opened the oven door. A wave of dry, intense heat hit her face, carrying the faint, baked-on scent of previous dinners. She slid the tray onto the middle rack and closed the door with a firm, metallic latch. Richard entered the kitchen a moment later, holding an empty tumbler. He had changed into a fresh wool sweater, navy blue and thick. He stood near the island, his nose twitching slightly. "What is that smell?" Richard asked, looking around the room with a slight frown. "Is someone cooking with sesame oil again?" Lynn did not look up from the broccoli stems she was collecting for the compost bin. "No, Richard, I am only baking chicken. Must be the people next door then," Richard muttered, walking over to the sink to rinse his glass. The Lees. They had some delivery service drop off several boxes this afternoon. Smelled like vinegar and old cabbage. You would think people would have some consideration for the neighborhood guidelines. The breeze carries everything right over the fence. It is quite unpleasant when you are trying to enjoy the patio. Lynn felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in her chest. Her grandmother in Da Nang used to make fermented cabbage and fish sauces in large earthenware jars in the courtyard. The smell was the scent of her childhood, of warmth, of family gathering around a low table on hot summer nights. To Richard, it was an association violation. To Richard, it was a nuisance that lowered the value of his manicured lawn. She kept her voice smooth. "The wind is shifting," she said. "It should clear up soon." Richard made a low, non-committal sound in his throat and walked back toward the den, his glass clinking against his ring. Eleanor returned, carrying Leo on her hip. The toddler was rubbing his eyes, his cheeks flushed pink from sleep. He saw Lynn and reached out a chubby hand, whimpering softly. "Mommy," he murmured. Lynn stepped forward, her arms naturally opening to receive him. But Eleanor shifted her weight, turning her shoulder slightly, so that Leo was gently shielded from Lynn's reach. "Oh, let's keep him away from the hot stove, dear," Eleanor said, her voice dripping with maternal concern. "He is still so drowsy. I will take him into the dining room and get him settled in his high chair. You just focus on the chicken. We don't want it to dry out." Lynn's hands remained empty in the air. The cool kitchen breeze brushed against her bare palms. She stood there for a second, her chest tight, watching her mother-in-law carry her son out of the room. She turned back to the sink, picked up the sponge, and began to scrub the cutting board, the rough surface scratching against her fingertips in the quiet, empty kitchen. The dining room table was solid cherry, polished to such a high sheen that the low light from the crystal chandelier reflected off its surface like gold coins on dark water. A white linen runner ran down the center, perfectly straight, its edges aligned with the table's grain. Lynn placed the porcelain serving bowl of steamed broccoli on the trivet, then returned to the kitchen for the platter of chicken. When she sat down, the family was already in their places. Richard sat at the head of the table, his posture upright and imposing. Eleanor sat to his right, and Thomas was on his left. Lynn sat next to Thomas, with Leo's high chair positioned on her other side. The only sound for several seconds was the clinking of silver forks against the heavy china. Lynn picked up her fork. She had served herself a small breast of chicken and a single scoop of white rice. The chicken was dry, the white meat stringy and devoid of moisture, just as Eleanor preferred. To cook it any less, Eleanor believed, was to invite food poisoning into the house. Lynn took a small bite. It tasted of nothing but salt and the faint metallic tang of the oven rack. Richard cleared his throat, a deep, rumbling sound that always signaled the beginning of his dinner monologues. "I ran into Arthur at the club today," he said, looking at Thomas. "He says the county zoning board is pushing through the new development on the South Ridge. They are planning to put in townhomes." Thomas shook his head, chewing his chicken. "Townhomes? That is going to ruin the traffic on the parkway, not to mention what it will do to the property values on this side of the valley." "Exactly what I told him," Richard said, pointing his fork at his son. "It is a complete disregard for the aesthetic integrity of the area. But of course the board only cares about the tax base. They don't have to live next to the congestion." Lynn reached out to cut a small piece of broccoli for Leo. The toddler was playing with his plastic spoon, banging it gently against the tray of his high chair. "Lynn, dear," Eleanor's voice cut through the men's conversation, soft but firm. "Don't give him too much of the rice. He gets so easily backed up when he has too much starch. Just a little broccoli and perhaps a tiny sliver of the chicken." Lynn had already portioned Leo's plate with a careful balance of vegetables and a very small amount of rice, which she had softened with a spoonful of warm water. She looked at Eleanor, then down at Leo's plate. The urge to state that she knew her own son's digestive habits better than anyone else rose in her chest. She calculated the energy of the defense. If she spoke, Eleanor would look hurt, her eyes widening with that gentle, misunderstood expression she used to shut down any opposition. Thomas would look up from his plate, annoyed by the tension, and say, "Lynn, Mom is just trying to help." Lynn quietly took her spoon and scooped half of the rice off Leo's plate, returning it to the serving bowl in the center of the table. "I will keep an eye on him," she said. "Thank you, sweetheart," Eleanor said, smiling warmly before turning her attention back to her husband. "It is just that he has such a delicate system. We must be so careful." Thomas reached for the glass carafe of ice water that sat in the middle of the table. He poured a full glass for his father, then one for his mother, and then filled his own glass to the brim. He placed the heavy crystal carafe back down on the linen runner, closer to Richard's side of the table. He did not look at Lynn's glass, which stood empty and dry next to her plate. Lynn looked at the condensation forming on the side of the carafe. Her throat felt tight, dry, and hot. The cough she had been suppressing all afternoon tickled the back of her windpipe, a sharp, persistent irritation. She needed water. She calculated her options. If she reached across the table to grab the heavy carafe, she would have to lean in front of Thomas, interrupting the flow of his conversation with Richard. Thomas would notice her empty glass and make a big display of pouring it for her, apologizing with a loud, performative tone that would draw everyone's attention. Richard would pause his speech, waiting with polite annoyance for the distraction to pass. She decided to wait. She took another bite of the dry chicken, swallowing it with difficulty, forcing it down her dry throat. "And what about the dinner party tomorrow, Richard?" Eleanor asked, her voice shifting the topic smoothly. "Did Arthur say if he and Margaret would be attending?" "They are coming," Richard said, nodding. "But Margaret is on some new diet. No gluten, no dairy, no nightshades. I told him we were having a classic pot roast, and he said that should be fine, as long as the gravy isn't thickened with flour." "Oh, we can easily manage that," Eleanor said, glancing toward Lynn. "Lynn can just use cornstarch. Or perhaps we can leave the gravy off her plate entirely." "Lynn, you will make sure to keep Margaret's portion separate, won't you? We don't want any mix-ups." "I can do that," Lynn said. Her voice sounded slightly raspy, even to her own ears. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at Lynn. "You are very quiet tonight, dear, and your voice sounds a bit thin. You aren't catching that cold that has been going around the neighborhood, are you?" Lynn felt the collective gaze of the table shift to her. Thomas paused his fork halfway to his mouth, his brow furrowing. "With the dinner party tomorrow," Eleanor continued, her tone dropping into a lower, more serious register, "we really can't have anyone being under the weather. It would be quite dreadful if our guests felt unsafe." "I am just a little tired," Lynn said, keeping her eyes on her plate. The silver polishing took a bit of time. Eleanor smiled, a quick, relieved expression. "Oh, of course. It is hard work, but the results are so worth it. The house simply wouldn't feel the same without that proper traditional care." Lynn nodded. She did not look up again. She picked up a single piece of broccoli, chewed it slowly, and waited for the grandfather clock in the hall to chime the next hour, counting the seconds in the heavy, air-conditioned silence of the room. The house was completely dark when Lynn walked down the stairs at 10:30. The only light came from the green digital display of the microwave and the soft blue glow of the landscaping lights outside the kitchen window. The hardwood floor felt cold against the soles of her feet, a sharp contrast to the heavy wool blankets she had just crawled out from under. Upstairs, Thomas was fast asleep, his steady, heavy breathing filling their bedroom. He had finished his Tokyo merger call at 9, closed his laptop with a satisfied sigh, and immediately climbed into bed, leaving Lynn to finish putting Leo to sleep and fold the final basket of laundry. Lynn walked to the refrigerator. The seal broke with a quiet suction sound, and the interior light flooded the kitchen, casting long, sharp shadows across the white quartz countertops. She reached into the crisper drawer and pulled out the small paper bag containing the fresh ginger. She set the ginger on the counter. She did not turn on the overhead lights. She did not want to disturb the quiet of the house, nor did she want Eleanor to see the kitchen active at this hour. She kept her movements small and deliberate. She picked up a small paring knife. Holding the cool, knobby root in her palm, she sliced off 3 thin rounds. The skin of the ginger was rough and fibrous, but as the blade sank in, the sharp, spicy, and slightly sweet scent released into the air. It was a potent, lively smell, completely different from the sterile lavender and lemon cleaners that dominated the house during the day. Lynn closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent. It warmed her throat even before she tasted it. She placed the ginger slices into her favorite ceramic mug, one she had brought with her from her small apartment before she married Thomas. It was a simple, unevenly glazed blue mug, entirely out of place among the pristine, matching porcelain sets Eleanor had selected for the kitchen cabinets. She filled the electric kettle with tap water and pressed the switch down. The quiet, high-pitched hum of the heating element began to grow, vibrating through the stone countertop. While she waited for the water to boil, she turned to the kitchen island. In the dim light, she noticed something. On the polished quartz surface, right where she had spent 20 minutes wiping down the counter after Sunday dinner, sat an empty beer bottle. Next to it was a small stoneware plate covered in yellow potato chip crumbs, a greasy, crumpled paper towel, and a half-eaten sandwich crust. Thomas had come down for a late-night snack after his work call. He had not put the plate in the dishwasher, which was empty and waiting. He had not thrown the paper towel into the trash can, which was less than 3 feet away under the sink. He had simply left them on the counter, confident that they would vanish by morning. To Thomas, and to Eleanor, clean counters were a natural state of the house, like oxygen or gravity, requiring no human effort to exist. Lynn stood before the mess. Usually, her physical routine would take over. She would pick up the plate, rinse it, place it in the dishwasher, throw the paper towel away, and wipe the sticky circular ring of dried beer from the quartz with a damp cloth. She would do this because she knew that if Eleanor came down at 6 in the morning and saw a mess, Eleanor would not blame her son. Eleanor would look at Lynn with a gentle, questioning expression and say, "Lynn, dear, did we forget to tidy the island last night?" The blame would always land on the daughter-in-law, who was brought in to manage the domestic sphere. Lynn looked at the dried beer ring. It was dark, sticky, and obvious. She calculated the toll of her labor. She felt the heavy, dull ache in her lower back. Her throat was raw, and the steam from the kettle was just beginning to rise, promising a brief moment of relief. If she cleaned Thomas's mess, she would preserve the illusion of the perfect self-cleaning home. She would protect Thomas from his mother's mild disapproval, and she would protect herself from Eleanor's passive-aggressive reminders. But she was so tired. Lynn reached out, but instead of picking up the plate, she adjusted her blue mug, placing it on the opposite side of the counter, far away from Thomas's dirty dishes. She decided to leave them. She would leave the plate, the paper towel, the sandwich crust, and the sticky beer ring exactly where Thomas had abandoned them. This was the first time she had ever left a mess in the kitchen overnight. It was a small, almost invisible shift in her daily routine. It felt heavy, like a stone dropped into a quiet well, but it also felt like a tiny, quiet pocket of air in her chest. The kettle clicked off, the sudden silence in the kitchen, heavy and absolute. Lynn poured the boiling water into her blue mug. The water turned a pale golden yellow as the ginger began to steep, sending up a fragrant plume of steam. She wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her palms. She did not sit at the dining table. Instead, she stood by the window, looking out into the dark, manicured backyard. The reflection of the kitchen showed her own quiet, tired face, and behind her, the single dirty plate sitting on the white quartz island, a tiny monument to a domestic contract she was slowly, silently beginning to rewrite. She took a slow sip of the hot tea. The ginger burned her throat, sharp and deep. But for the first time in days, the pain felt like her own. The gray, slate-colored light of a Monday morning filtered through the high kitchen windows, casting a cold pall over the white quartz island. Lynn stood by the sink, the measuring scoop in her hand, hovering over a tin of powdered baby formula. Her fingers were cold, and her throat felt thick, but the persistent tickle from the night before had subsided into a dull, dry ache. On the counter to her right, Thomas's mess remained exactly as he had left it. The half-eaten sandwich crust had dried, its edges curling upward like old autumn leaves. The circular ring of dried beer from the bottle had hardened into a dark, sticky varnish on the pristine quartz, catching a few stray specks of dust in the morning light. At 6:20, the soft, rhythmic click of Eleanor's house shoes sounded on the stairs. Lynn did not turn around. She kept her focus on the bottle in her hand, carefully leveling the scoop of white powder against the metal rim of the tin. She emptied the scoop into the bottle, the fine dust settling silently to the bottom. Eleanor entered the kitchen, her silk morning robe flowing behind her, smelling of lavender soap and fresh laundry. She headed directly toward the built-in espresso machine, her mind clearly occupied with the long checklist for the evening's dinner party. She reached for her favorite ceramic espresso cup, but as she turned to place it under the nozzle, her gaze caught the island. She stopped. Her eyes lingered on the dirty plate, the crumpled, greasy paper towel, and the empty beer bottle. The silence in the kitchen stretched, punctuated only by the low, mechanical, warming hum of the espresso machine. Lynn could feel Eleanor's eyes shift from the clutter to the back of her head. It was a heavy, expectant gaze, the kind of look designed to prompt an immediate, apologetic scramble. "Oh, dear," Eleanor said, her voice carrying that light, breezy tone she used when she wanted to deliver a reprimand disguised as a casual observation. "We must have had a bit of a late night." Lynn carefully poured the warm water into the baby bottle, watching the liquid rise precisely to the 6-ounce line. She did not look at the island. She did not look at Eleanor. "Thomas had his merger call until past 9, Lynn said, her voice quiet and even. "Yes, he mentioned it was quite stressful," Eleanor said. She waited. The silence returned, thicker this time. Eleanor's hand remained hovering near her espresso cup, her fingers twitching slightly. She was waiting for Lynn to apologize, to grab the sponge, to sweep the clutter away and restore the kitchen to its proper, sterile state. Instead, Lynn twisted the plastic nipple and collar onto the baby bottle, tightening it until the threads clicked. She raised the bottle and began to shake it, the rhythmic, wet, sloshing sound filling the quiet room. Eleanor's eyebrows twitched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that only someone who had studied her face for 4 years would notice. She cleared her throat. "Well," she said, her voice losing a fraction of its melody, "we really do need the island completely clear today, sweetheart. The florist is dropping off the table arrangements at 10, and the caterer will need every inch of space for the prep trays. We can't have the kitchen looking untidy when they arrive." "The florists usually use the side table in the foyer to unpack," Lynn said, "and the caterer has their own folding prep tables in the garage." Eleanor blinked. The polite, comfortable script she had used for years, a script where her gentle suggestions were immediately treated as absolute commands, had suddenly hit a wall of flat, polite facts. She looked at the sticky beer ring, then back at Lynn, who was now checking the temperature of the formula on the inside of her wrist. "I see," Eleanor said. Her voice had gone quite thin. "But still, dear, it is just a matter of basic housekeeping, isn't it? We don't want things piling up." Lynn wiped a stray drop of milk from her wrist with a clean thumb. She looked Eleanor directly in the eyes. Her gaze was calm, empty of both anger and apology. "I will take Leo up his bottle," Lynn said. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She left the dirty plate, the beer bottle, and the dried, sticky ring sitting right where they were, directly in front of Eleanor. As Lynn reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped and listened. For several seconds there was nothing but the quiet drip of the espresso machine. Then came the harsh, wet squeak of a sponge being dragged across the quartz counter. It was followed by the sharp clink of porcelain as the plate was lifted, and the heavy metallic thud of the trash can drawer being slid open with unnecessary force. Lynn stood in the dim hallway, the warm baby bottle in her hand. She felt the heavy, quiet power of her silence. For 4 years she had carried the friction of this house, absorbing every careless mess, every small neglect, to keep the surface perfect. By simply doing nothing, she had forced Eleanor to feel the weight of her own son's carelessness. And she had forced her to clean it. Lynn turned and walked up the stairs to her son, a cold, quiet resolve settling deep into her bones. The laundry room was a narrow, windowless space tucked behind the kitchen, heated by the steady, warm exhaust of the dryer and the intense, damp heat of the iron. Lynn stood over the padded ironing board, her right shoulder aching from the repetitive pressing motion. She was ironing the formal linen napkins, a set of 40 off-white squares with delicate openwork borders that Eleanor had brought back from a trip to Belgium years ago. The linen was stiff and dry. To get the creases perfectly flat, Lynn had to mist each napkin with water, wait a few seconds for the fibers to soften, and then press the heavy iron down with all her weight. A loud, wet hiss rose from the fabric as the hot metal plate met the damp linen. A cloud of hot, starchy steam billowed up, dampening the loose strands of hair around Lynn's face and clinging to her skin. From the front foyer, the heavy oak door opened, followed by the sound of muffled voices. The florist had arrived. Lynn could hear the rustle of heavy brown butcher paper and the plastic tubs scraping against the hardwood floor. Eleanor's voice rose above the noise, bright, energetic, and perfectly modulated for company. "Oh, yes, right there on the entryway console," Eleanor was saying. "The light is much better there. My daughter-in-law will be out in just a moment to help you clear the old decorative bowls." Lynn did not move. She did not set the iron down. She picked up another dry napkin, laid it flat on the board, and pressed the spray trigger. A fine, cool mist settled over the linen. The scent of the florist's delivery began to drift down the hallway, leaking into the laundry room. It was a heavy, sweet, and slightly medicinal smell, a mixture of damp cedar shavings, crushed eucalyptus leaves, and cold water from the bottom of a flower bucket. It was a clean, expensive scent. But beneath it, Lynn could detect the faint, sour odor of cut stems beginning to decay in the warmth of the house. The door to the laundry room clicked open. Thomas stood in the doorway. He was wearing his dark charcoal suit trousers and a pair of black leather dress shoes, but his torso was bare, his pale skin looking stark against the white doorframe. His hair was wet and combed back, and he held a crumpled blue Oxford shirt in one hand. "Lynn," Thomas said, his voice carrying a tight, hurried edge, "where is my blue shirt, the one with the French cuffs? I have the pre-dinner lunch with the partners in 45 minutes. Lynn did not look up from the napkin. "It is in the laundry basket on top of the dryer," she said, her voice steady over the low hum of the dryer. Thomas stepped fully into the room, his eyes scanning the space until they landed on the plastic basket. He reached in and pulled the blue shirt out. He held it up by the shoulders. His brow furrowed as he stared at the fabric. "It is wrinkled," he said, his tone shifting from hurried to bewildered. "It is just sitting here. It is not on a hanger." "I washed and folded the laundry yesterday," Lynn said, gliding the hot iron over the Belgian lace border. "I didn't have time to press the shirts before Leo woke up." Thomas stared at her. He looked at the shirt in his hand, then at the iron, and then back at Lynn. "But my meeting is in less than an hour, Lynn," he said. He spoke slowly, as if explaining a very simple concept to a child. "I can't wear a wrinkled shirt to a lunch with the managing partners. You always have my shirts ready on Monday mornings." Lynn calculated the energy of the moment. Usually she would immediately set the iron down, apologize for her oversight, take the blue shirt from his hand, and spend 10 minutes meticulously pressing the collar, the cuffs, and the front placket while he stood by, checking his watch and sighing. She would do this while the linen napkins cooled and wrinkled again, knowing she would have to start them over later and face Eleanor's quiet disapproval when the table was not set on time. She looked at the corner of the blue shirt. It was a premium cotton shirt, expensive and stiff. Thomas was 32 years old. He had been a partner at his law firm for 2 years. "The iron is hot," Lynn said, keeping her eyes on the off-white linen beneath her hands. "You can use it when I am finished with the napkins." Thomas didn't move. He stood there, the blue shirt dangling from his fingers like a limp flag. "When you are finished?" he repeated, his voice rising slightly in pitch. "Lynn, I don't know how to iron the cuffs properly. The starch always gets clumpy when I do it. Can't you just do this one real quick? It will take you 2 minutes. I have 24 more napkins to press," Lynn said, her voice flat, devoid of any rising anger. "Eleanor needs them on the table before the florist finishes the centerpieces at 11. If I stop now, the table won't be ready." "But my meeting," Thomas insisted, his face flushing slightly. "The iron will be free in about 20 minutes, Lynn said. Thomas stared at her for several long seconds, his mouth opening slightly as if he were about to argue, but the absolute, unyielding calm in her face seemed to stop him. He let out a sharp, irritated breath, tossed the blue shirt onto the top of the dryer, and snatched a wrinkled gray knit polo from the clean laundry basket instead. "I will just wear this under my jacket," he muttered, his tone thick with resentment. "I guess I will just have to keep my coat on during the lunch." Lynn did not answer. She did not offer to iron the polo. She did not apologize. Thomas grabbed his shirt and left the room, slamming the door behind him with enough force to make the plastic laundry basket on top of the dryer rattle. Lynn stood in the quiet laundry room, the warm, damp air enveloping her. She picked up another dry Belgian napkin, laid it flat on the board, and pressed the steam button. The loud, wet hiss filled the small space again, washing away the sound of the front door opening and closing as Thomas left the house. The weight of his anger felt light, almost insignificant, compared to the small, steady flame of control she was slowly reclaiming, crease by crease, in the damp heat of the room. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the kitchen had been taken over by the caterer and his 2 assistants. The quiet, sterile order of the house was replaced by the frantic energy of professional preparation. Heavy copper pots clashed against the commercial gas range, and the air was thick with the rich, savory smell of browning beef, toasted peppercorns, and red wine simmering into a glaze. A cold, sharp draft cut through the room every few minutes as the assistants carried large plastic tubs of crushed ice and pre-chilled white wine bottles through the side door. Lynn stood in the adjacent dining room, carefully placing the freshly ironed linen napkins next to the sterling silver dinner forks. She folded each square into a simple, clean rectangle, laying them flat on the dark cherry wood. The physical routine of setting the table was something she usually did in complete silence, adjusting each plate and glass until the lines were perfectly straight. Today, however, her hands felt slightly stiff, the skin on her thumbs dry from the heat of the iron. Eleanor walked into the dining room carrying a silver-rimmed clipboard. She had changed into a tailored silk blouse of soft sage green, her hair perfectly coiffed, though there was a thin, tight line around her mouth that had not been there in the morning. She walked to the head of the table, her eyes scanning the layout. She stopped, her gaze dropping to the flat, rectangular napkins. "Lynn, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into that familiar, disappointed lilt. "The napkins. We decided on the triple fold, didn't we? The rectangles look so plain, dear. almost like a diner or a casual brunch. We want the table to feel structured for Richard's associates. "The linen is very thick," Lynn said, keeping her voice calm and level as she aligned a water goblet. "The triple fold will not hold its shape without a heavy coat of spray starch, and we ran out of starch this morning." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly against her clipboard. "Well, surely we have more in the laundry room, in the cabinet under the sink?" "I used the last of it on Thomas's shirt collar last week," Lynn said. "I wrote it on the grocery list on the refrigerator 4 days ago." Eleanor blinked, her gaze shifting toward the kitchen where the refrigerator stood. The grocery list was a small magnetic pad where Lynn meticulously wrote down every running out item. Eleanor passed it multiple times a day, but she had never once looked at it. To Eleanor, the pantry and the laundry supplies were self-replenishing resources, maintained by some invisible force that required none of her attention. "Oh," Eleanor said, her voice dry. "Well, we should have picked some up. But surely we can still manage a simple fan fold. It doesn't require nearly as much starch, and it stands up so beautifully in the water glasses." Lynn looked at the brass grandfather clock in the hall. It was exactly 1:15. Leo's nap time was at 1:30. She calculated the time. Folding 40 heavy linen napkins into intricate fan shapes and tucking them into 40 crystal glasses would take at least 45 minutes of precise, finger-cramping work. If she stayed here to do it, she would miss Leo's wind-down routine. He would become overtired, and with the loud clatter of the caterers in the kitchen directly below his nursery, he would not sleep. He would cry, and Thomas would not be home to help, as his business lunch was scheduled to run until 3. "I need to put Leo down for his nap now, Eleanor," Lynn said. "He is already rubbing his eyes. Can't Thomas—" "Oh, that is right. Thomas is still at his lunch," Eleanor said, her tone carrying a sudden, sharp edge of impatience. "Well, perhaps you can do them after he falls asleep? It won't take you long." "He sleeps better when I stay in the room," Lynn said. "The caterers are very loud today, and the noise from the kitchen will wake him if I am not there to quiet him." Eleanor stood by the head of the table, her clipboard pressed flat against her chest. The polite, gentle mask she wore so easily was straining. For years, Lynn had worked around every obstacle, skipping her own meals, staying up past midnight, and sacrificing her own time with her son to ensure that Eleanor's aesthetic demands were met. Now Lynn was simply presenting her with a choice: her grandson's sleep or the shape of the napkins. "But what about the table?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight. "The guests will be here at 6. We can't have the table looking half-finished." "The flat fold is a classic European style," Lynn said, her voice soft and entirely unbothered. "It highlights the quality of the linen." Before Eleanor could reply, one of the caterer's assistants entered the dining room, carrying a heavy wooden tray of polished red wine glasses. "Excuse me, ma'am," the assistant said, looking at Eleanor. "Where would you like the water carafe set up?" Eleanor turned toward the assistant, her attention fractured. "Just on the sideboard, please," she said, her voice tight with frustration. Lynn quietly stepped away from the table. She did not wait to be dismissed. She walked out of the dining room and climbed the stairs to the second floor, her steps slow and deliberate. As she reached the top of the stairs, the noise from the kitchen faded, replaced by the soft, warm quiet of the upper hallway. She entered the nursery. Leo was sitting in his crib, clutching his stuffed bear, his eyelids heavy. Lynn sat down in the wooden rocking chair in the corner of the dim room. She lifted her son into her lap, resting his warm, heavy head against her shoulder. The smell of baby powder and sweet, clean sweat washed over her, completely erasing the scent of the caterer's red wine reduction and Eleanor's lavender perfume. Downstairs, the muffled sound of a plate clinking against the cherry table echoed through the floorboards. Someone was folding the napkins, and for the first time in 4 years, it was not Lynn. She leaned her head back against the wooden slats of the rocker, closing her eyes as she began to gently swing, letting the quiet rhythm of the nursery carry her away from the house below. The vanity mirror in the master bedroom was framed in dark, polished oak, reflecting the soft, muted gray of the late afternoon sky. Lynn sat on the wooden stool, drawing a black plastic hairbrush through her long, dark hair. The physical routine was slow and comforting. With each stroke, the plastic bristles caught the dry winter air, producing a soft, static crackle that sounded like tiny, dry leaves brushing against a window pane. She kept her movements measured, counting the strokes in her head. 21, 22, 23. Through the heating vent in the floor, the heavy, warm smell of the kitchen had begun to rise, filling the bedroom. The caterer had placed the rosemary-crusted beef into the oven, and the sharp, pine-like aroma of the herbs mixed with the sweet caramel scent of roasting garlic. It was a rich, overwhelming scent, but to Lynn it felt like a warning. The guests would be arriving in less than 2 hours. The heavy bedroom door opened. Thomas walked in. He did not look at her. He walked straight to the dresser, reached into his trouser pockets, and tossed his car keys, wallet, and a handful of loose change onto the polished wood. The metal clattered loudly, a sharp, jarring noise in the quiet room. He was still wearing his charcoal trousers, but he had taken off his suit jacket. Underneath, the gray knit polo shirt he had grabbed from the clean laundry basket was visibly wrinkled, the collar limp and slightly twisted. His face was flushed, and a thin sheen of sweat was visible along his hairline. He threw himself onto the edge of the unmade bed, the mattress groaning under his weight. He let out a long, heavy sigh. "I had to keep my wool blazer on for 3 solid hours, Lynn," Thomas said, his voice thick with irritation. The private dining room at the club had some issue with the thermostat. It was almost 80 degrees in there. Arthur kept asking me if I was feeling all right because I wouldn't take my jacket off. I was literally sweating through my undershirt. Lynn did not stop brushing her hair. She watched his reflection in the mirror. The static crackle of the brush continued. 28, 29, 30. "The polo was clean," she said, her voice quiet. "It was wrinkled, Lynn," Thomas said, turning his head to look at her back. He sounded incredulous. "It looked like I had pulled it out of a gym bag. I am a senior associate. I am trying to make partner this year. I can't sit at a table with the managing partners looking like I don't know how to use an iron. It is embarrassing." Lynn set the hairbrush down on the vanity table. The plastic met the wood with a quiet, dull thud. For years, she had carried the belief that Thomas's professional appearance was a direct reflection of her worth as a wife. She had spent hours standing over the ironing board late at night, starching his collars, pressing his trousers, and making sure every crease was sharp enough to cut paper. She had done this while he slept, while he worked, while he ignored her. She had absorbed his panic, his pressure, and his expectations, believing it was her duty to keep his life running without a single friction point. Now she looked at his flushed, annoyed face in the mirror, and she felt nothing but a cool, analytical distance. She turned her body slightly on the stool, looking at him directly. "I folded 5 loads of laundry yesterday," Lynn said, her voice flat, carrying no emotional weight. "I polished the sterling silver tea service this morning. I ironed 40 heavy linen napkins for your mother's dinner. I put Leo down for his nap so he wouldn't cry through your father's dinner party. I had to choose what to leave undone, Thomas. I chose your shirt." Thomas stared at her, his mouth open slightly, his brows knitting together in genuine confusion. He was prepared for an apology. He was prepared for her to explain her mistake, to say she had been busy, to offer to iron 3 of his shirts right now to make up for it. He was not prepared for the cold, logical ledger of her day. "Well," he muttered, his gaze dropping to his leather shoes, "you could have asked me to help." "I did," Lynn said, "yesterday afternoon. You told me you had to prepare for your Tokyo merger call." Thomas had no reply. He shifted his weight on the bed, the leather of his shoes scraping against the rug. He looked at his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, but he did not tap it. The quiet in the room returned, heavy and suffocating. "My mother folded the napkins," Thomas said after a long pause, his voice lower now, almost defensive. "She was downstairs just now, complaining about how stiff they are. She said they are hurtfully hard to crease without the proper starch. She wanted them folded," Lynn said. Thomas looked up at her, his eyes searching her face. There was a flicker of something new in his expression, a subtle, uneasy realization. She was not angry, she was not yelling, but she was entirely out of his reach. She was treating him with the same polite, distant courtesy she might show to a stranger on a bus. "I'm going to take a shower," Thomas said, standing up quickly. "The guests will be here soon." He walked into the bathroom and shut the door. A moment later, the high-pitched hum of the exhaust fan started, followed by the heavy, rushing sound of hot water hitting the fiberglass shower stall. Lynn turned back to the vanity. She picked up the black hairbrush. She began to brush her hair again, her movements smooth and unbroken. 21, 22, 23. The smell of the rosemary-crusted beef continued to rise through the floorboards, but in the quiet bedroom, Lynn only smelled the clean, sharp static of her own hair. A private, quiet space she was no longer willing to share. The heavy brass doorbell chimed at exactly 5:30. It was a deep Westminster sequence that vibrated through the oak floorboards of the entryway, signalling the arrival of the first guests. Lynn stood near the bottom of the stairs, holding Leo against her hip. The toddler was restless. He was dressed in a stiff, miniature blue Oxford shirt and khaki trousers that Eleanor had purchased for him. The starch in the collar was irritating his skin, and he kept reaching up with his chubby fingers, scratching at his neck and whimpering. Lynn gently pulled his hand away, whispering soft, rhythmic Vietnamese words of comfort into his ear, her voice a low, warm murmur that stayed entirely between the two of them.
Richard opened the front door, letting in a sudden, sharp gust of cold evening air. Arthur and Margaret stepped into the warm foyer, their wool coats smelling of damp mist and car leather. Margaret immediately began unwrapping a heavy silk scarf, releasing a cloud of her signature perfume. It was a dry, powdery rose and lavender scent, so thick it felt like fine dust settling in the air. "Oh, Arthur!" Margaret. Eleanor's voice rang out from the living room, bright and musical as she floated into the foyer. "Come in, come in. The wind is simply dreadful tonight, isn't it? Let Richard take your coats." Arthur, a tall man with thick gold-rimmed glasses and a permanent professional smile, shook Richard's hand. "It certainly is. The Ridge Road was completely iced over in places." As Eleanor guided them toward the warmth of the living room, her eyes landed on Lynn and Leo. Her smile widened, but her posture became slightly rigid, a subtle shift that Lynn knew meant she was performing. "And here is our Lynn," Eleanor said, gesturing toward Lynn with a manicured hand. "And our little prince. Lynn did the table settings for us today, Margaret. Quite minimalist, as you'll see. Very rustic." Margaret turned her gaze to Lynn, her eyes scanning her from her simple beige shift dress down to her flat leather shoes. Her expression was polite but distant, the patronizing smile of a woman used to addressing service staff. "Oh, how lovely," Margaret said, tilting her head. "It is so nice that you have someone to help with the heavy lifting, Eleanor. It must be quite an adjustment for you, dear, coming from, where was it again? Thailand?" "Vietnam," Lynn said quietly. Her voice was steady, carrying no trace of irritation. "Ah, yes, of course," Margaret said, her smile never wavering. "So charming. I hear the food there is quite vibrant. Lots of fresh herbs." "Yes," Eleanor chimed in, stepping closer to Lynn and gently patting Leo's back. "We are slowly getting her used to our traditional dishes. Sometimes we have to gently steer her away from the heavier, more pungent spices. We don't want the house smelling like an open-air market, of course. But she is a very quick study. Richard has been so pleased with her progress." Thomas joined them in the foyer, holding a lowball glass of amber bourbon. He stood next to his mother, his posture relaxed, but his eyes darted to Lynn. He was watching her, waiting to see how she would react. For years, Lynn had played along with these introductions. She would smile, nod, and make some small, self-deprecating comment about her English or her cooking, allowing Eleanor to look like the benevolent mentor who had rescued her from a less civilized life. It was a performance that kept the peace, a small sacrifice of her dignity to ensure the dinner parties went smoothly. Lynn calculated the energy required to play the role tonight. She looked at Margaret's expensive gold necklace, the sparkling ice in Thomas's glass, and the smooth, untroubled expression on Eleanor's face. They had built a beautiful, pristine cage, and they expected her to sing inside it on cue. She felt the dry, hot air of the heating vent rising around her ankles. She looked at Leo, who was still tugging at his stiff collar. "Leo needs his dinner," Lynn said. Her voice was flat, polite, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Excuse me." She did not smile. She did not laugh at Eleanor's joke about the open-air market. She simply turned her back on the group and walked toward the kitchen, her steps slow and deliberate. The silence that followed her departure was palpable, a sudden cold drop in the foyer's temperature. Behind her,
She heard Eleanor let out a quick, nervous little laugh, her silk robe rustling. "Oh, well, she is so devoted to the baby," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a slightly strained, defensive edge. "Sometimes she gets so focused on his schedule. You know how young mothers can be." Thomas did not speak. From the corner of her eye, as she crossed the threshold into the hallway, Lynn saw him lower his glass of bourbon, his gaze fixed on the empty space where she had just been standing. He looked unsettled, the first real shadow of doubt crossing his face. Lynn walked into the dimly lit pantry at the back of the kitchen. She set Leo down on the clean floor, letting him crawl near her feet. She leaned her back against the cool wooden shelves, breathing in the quiet, dark space. The dinner party was starting downstairs, the laughter of the guests beginning to echo through the walls. But Lynn felt entirely separate from it. She was no longer a part of their performance. She had stepped off the stage, and the cold, quiet dark of the pantry felt like the beginning of her freedom. The nursery was dark, save for the faint green digital display of the humidifier on the dresser. Leo was asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a slow, comforting rhythm. Lynn sat on the thick rug beside his crib, the screen of her smartphone turned down to its lowest brightness setting, casting a cool, pale blue glow over her fingers. On the screen was a secure web browser tab displaying her private bank account. It was an account Thomas did not know about, opened under her maiden name using her sister's address in another state. Over the last 6 months, Lynn had been quietly moving small sums of money into it. $100 here from her remaining freelance translation clients, $50 there from the cash Eleanor gave her for the high-end organic grocery runs. It was a slow, painstaking process, a digital ledger of her quiet escape. Today, the balance had reached $4,000. It was not a fortune, but it was enough for 2 plane tickets and a deposit on a quiet apartment far away from this manicured suburb. She closed the tab and opened a messaging application. She typed a brief message to her sister Trang in Da Nang. "The documents are safe," Lynn wrote, her fingers tapping the glass without making a sound. "I have the papers in the box." She looked up at Leo. When they were alone in the dark, she no longer spoke to him in English. She leaned closer to the wooden slats of the crib, her breath warm against his hair. "Nu di conye," she whispered, her voice a soft, musical thread in the dark. "Ngai mai moi tu se kak." She was teaching him her language, word by word, in the quiet hours of the night. It was a secret world they shared, one that Eleanor and Thomas could not enter. To them, Leo was a Whitford, destined for private academies and sailing lessons. To Lynn, he was her blood, and she would not let them erase the connection to her home. The soft creak of the nursery door broke the silence. Thomas stepped into the room. The yellow light from the hallway cut a sharp, wedged shadow across the blue rug. He smelled of rich chocolate cake, espresso, and the heavy warmth of bourbon. He had put on his suit jacket again, but his tie was slightly loosened. "Lynn," Thomas whispered, his voice carrying a tight, urgent hiss. "What are you doing up here? Mom is about to serve the coffee and the dessert. She needs help with the cups, and Arthur asked where you went." Leo was having trouble sleeping, Lynn said. She did not stand up. She slipped her phone into the pocket of her dress,
her fingers brushing against the cold, notched edge of the small brass key she kept hidden there, the key to her lockbox. "It is just a dinner party, Lynn," Thomas said, stepping closer to the crib. He looked down at Leo, then back at her, his jaw tight. "It is important for my career. You can't just hide up here in the dark. It looks weird. It makes it look like we are having problems." Lynn calculated the toll of his words. Thomas was not worried about Leo's sleep, nor was he worried about her throat, which still burned with a dry, quiet ache. He was worried about the performance. He was worried that Arthur and Margaret would notice the missing piece in the perfect domestic machine he had built. If she refused to go down, he would get angry. The tension would linger into the morning, and Eleanor would intervene with her soft, patronizing suggestions. It would create friction, and friction would draw attention to her. She needed them to remain comfortable. She needed them to believe she was still the quiet, obedient wife who would always bend to their will. "I will come down," Lynn said. She stood up slowly, her joints popping in the quiet room. She smoothed the front of her beige dress. "Good," Thomas said, his posture immediately relaxing. He reached out to pat her arm, a quick, dismissive gesture of approval. "Thanks, Lynn. It really means a lot. Mom worked so hard on this dinner." Lynn did not reply. She walked past him, entering the bright yellow light of the hallway. Downstairs, the dining room was warm and loud, the air thick with the smell of expensive coffee, burning candle wax, and melting chocolate. Eleanor was laughing, her high, melodic voice rising above the low murmur of the men's conversation. "Oh, here she is," Eleanor said as Lynn entered the room. "Lynn, dear, could you grab the silver demitasse spoons from the drawer? And we need the fresh cream from the fridge. Margaret doesn't take sugar." Lynn moved like a ghost around the table. She retrieved the small, polished spoons, placing them precisely next to each porcelain cup. She poured the heavy cream into a small silver pitcher, her movements fluid, practiced, and entirely empty. Arthur looked up at her as she set the cream down. "Thank you, Lynn," he said, smiling his professional smile. "Eleanor was just telling us about your family back in Vietnam. It must be so difficult being so far away from them." "It is quiet here," Lynn said, offering him a polite, hollow smile. "Yes," Eleanor chimed in, leaning forward to pat Margaret's hand. "But we do our best to make her feel at home. Don't we, sweetheart?" Lynn met Eleanor's eyes. The older woman's gaze was warm, bright, and completely empty of genuine curiosity. She did not see Lynn. She saw a successful project. "Yes, Eleanor," Lynn said, her voice smooth and sweet. "You have been very helpful." She turned and walked back to the kitchen to wash the dessert plates. As she turned on the warm water, the steam rising around her face, she reached into her pocket and squeezed the small brass key. The dinner party would end, the guests would leave, and the family would go to sleep, wrapped in the comfort of their pristine, perfect world. They would have no idea that every plate she washed, every spoon she polished, and every polite smile she gave was simply a quiet, steady step toward the day she would vanish, taking their grandson with her into a world they would never be allowed to touch. The house was completely still at midnight. Upstairs, Thomas slept heavily, his deep, rumbling snores a rhythmic barrier that allowed Lynn to slip out from under the heavy down comforter without a sound. She did not turn on any lights. She did not need to. She knew the layout of the second floor by heart.
every floorboard that creaked, every door frame that hung slightly out of alignment. She slipped down the hallway and entered Thomas's home office. The room was cool and smelled of expensive cedarwood polish and the stale, dry scent of old legal briefs. In the corner, the internet router blinked with a steady, mechanical green light, casting long, thin shadows across the leather armchair and the massive mahogany desk. Thomas's leather briefcase sat on the corner of the desk, right where he had dropped it after returning from his lunch. He never locked it. The concept of security within his own home was foreign to him. He lived with the absolute certainty that his space was sacrosanct, protected by the invisible shield of his family's status.
Lynn approached the desk, her bare feet silent on the thick Persian rug. She reached out and pressed her thumbs against the brass latches of the briefcase. They released with a dull, heavy clack that felt incredibly loud in the quiet room. She paused, holding her breath, listening for any shift in the house's ambient noise. There was only the distant low hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. She lifted the leather lid. The rich, heavy scent of the Italian leather mixed with the faint aroma of Thomas's brand-name cologne washed over her. It was a suffocating smell, one she had associated for years with his authority and her lack of it. She reached into the main compartment. Her fingers brushed past his gold-plated pen, a leather-bound notebook, and several folders of corporate tax filings. Near the back, in a separate zippered pouch, she found what she was looking for, a thick manila folder labeled Leo Whitford Trust. Lynn pulled the folder out, her fingers dry against the rough paper. She sat down in the leather desk chair, the cold wood pressing through her thin cotton nightgown. She opened the folder under the faint green glow of the router. This trust had been established by Richard and Eleanor when Leo was 3 months old. At the time, Thomas had handed her a thick stack of papers, telling her to just sign the acknowledgement form. "It is free money for his college, Lynn," he had said, his tone breezy and dismissive. "My parents are just setting up his future. You don't need to worry about the details." And she, exhausted from postpartum depression and the overwhelming weight of her new reality, had signed it without reading. Now she turned the pages slowly, the dry whisper of the paper, a soft repeating sound in the dark. She scanned the dense legal jargon, her eyes searching for the specific clauses her sister's friend, a family law attorney, had warned her to look for. She found it on page 8 under Section 4, Paragraph 2, Geographical Restriction. She read the words twice, her chest tightening with a cold, quiet anger. The disbursement of trust funds for the beneficiary's education, maintenance, and health care was strictly contingent upon the beneficiary's primary domicile remaining within a 60-mile radius of the primary estate of the trustees, Richard and Eleanor Whitford. Furthermore, if the beneficiary were to be relocated outside this geographical boundary without the express written consent of the trustees retained the unilateral legal right to petition the court for emergency temporary custody to protect the child's financial and educational interests. It was an iron cage wrapped in the language of ancestral generosity. Richard and Eleanor had not built a trust fund to secure Leo's future. They had built a spatial trap, a legal tether designed to ensure that Lynn could never leave with her son.
If she were to pack her bags and take Leo back to Vietnam, or even to her sister's house in another state, they would instantly trigger this clause. They would paint her in court as an unstable, reckless mother who had deliberately stripped her child of a multi-million-dollar inheritance, using their wealth to secure emergency custody before she could even board a plane. Thomas had known, or perhaps he hadn't cared, viewing the restriction as a natural, healthy way to keep his family together. To them, her compliance was a given. Linh sat in the dark, her heart beating in a slow, steady rhythm. She did not panic. She did not cry. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her smartphone. She opened her private, encrypted camera application, the one she had downloaded using a secure, virtual private network. She turned the screen brightness to its absolute minimum and ensured the shutter sound was disabled. Holding the phone steady over the desk, she began to photograph the pages, one by one. The signatures of Richard and Eleanor, the signature of Thomas, the seal of the notary, the specific paragraph detailing the geographical restriction. Each image was a clean digital copy of their trap, a blueprint of the cage they had built around her. When she finished, she placed the document back into the manila folder. She slid the folder back into the zipper pocket of the briefcase, exactly where she had found it. She lowered the leather lid, pressing the brass latches down until they clicked back into place with the same dull clack. She took a clean tissue from the box on the desk and wiped the polished metal latches, removing any trace of her fingerprints, any evidence that she had ever stepped into the room. She stood up, her body cold, but her mind entirely clear. They believed they had thought of everything. They believed their money, their status, and their clever legal clauses made them invincible, that they could keep her bound to this house forever through their sheer, heavy gravity. But they did not know that she now had the blueprint. They did not know that by showing her the limits of her cage, they had given her the exact coordinates of her escape. She walked out of the office and back toward the dark master bedroom, her silent feet carrying her forward into the cold, quiet preparation of her new life. The wet, rhythmic bubbling of the small pot on the gas range was the loudest sound in the kitchen at 7:15 on Tuesday morning. Linh stood by the stove, a wooden spoon in her hand, slowly stirring the white rice as it broke down into a thick, smooth porridge. She had slipped a single paper-thin slice of fresh ginger into the water, just enough to soothe Leo's stomach after the stress of the previous night. The steam rising from the pot was warm and smelled faintly of toasted sesame oil and clean starch, a comforting, heavy scent that grounded her in the cold morning light. She kept the stove's exhaust fan on its lowest setting. It was a delicate balance. She needed to draw the steam away, but she could not make too much noise. The house was still transitioning from the heavy sleep of the post-party night. While the porridge simmered, Linh stood near the pantry door, her body positioned so that anyone entering the kitchen from the hallway would see only her back. She pulled her smartphone from her apron pocket. She opened the encrypted messaging application. She selected the folder containing the 16 high-resolution photos of the trust document she had taken in the dark hours of the night. Her thumb hovered over the contact labeled Trang. Underneath the name was a secure secondary routing number her sister's attorney contact in California had provided. Linh tapped the screen. A tiny circular progress bar began to spin in the center of the dark display. 10%, 30%, 60%. She watched the bar, her thumb ready to lock the screen instantly if she heard a footstep on the stairs. 80%, 90%. Sent. A small green checkmark appeared next to the file. Lynn immediately selected the folder, tapped the delete option, and empty-trashed the application's temporary cache. She locked the screen, slid the phone back into her apron pocket, and took a deep, steady breath, her hand returning to the wooden spoon to stir the bubbling rice. At 7:30, the familiar, soft rustle of Eleanor's silk morning robe sounded from the hallway. Eleanor entered the kitchen, holding a small stack of thick, cream-colored thank you cards and a gold-plated fountain pen. She looked pleased, her face slightly flushed from the success of the dinner party, though there were dark, faint circles of exhaustion under her eyes. She set the cards down on the marble island, her gaze immediately drifting to the stove. "Good morning, Lynn," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a bright, slightly raspy edge. "Last night was a spectacular success, wasn't it? Richard was absolutely thrilled. Arthur mentioned that the firm's partners were incredibly impressed by how organized everything felt." Lynn kept her eyes on the pot. "I am glad they enjoyed it, Eleanor." "Yes, it was lovely," Eleanor said, though her tone dropped slightly as she stepped closer to the island. "Although, sweetheart, we did miss you during the coffee and dessert service. Margaret was quite disappointed she didn't get to chat with you more. She had so many questions about your family's history. It looked a bit unsociable, you leaving so early." "Leo was very restless," Lynn said, her voice smooth and entirely without apology. The noise from the dining room was keeping him awake. "Well," Eleanor said, letting out a short, soft sigh, "we must make sure his schedule is better managed next time. But dear, what is that on the stove? It has such a heavy smell for this hour of the morning. Is that ginger again?" "It is rice porridge for Leo," Lynn said. "It is very gentle on his system." Eleanor walked over to the range, her nose twitching slightly as she looked into the pot. "But we have the organic baby oatmeal in the pantry, dear. It is so much lighter, and it doesn't leave that lingering old-world scent in the air. We have the garden club ladies coming by for the planning luncheon tomorrow, and I'm just concerned the drapes will absorb the smell. You know how those heavy spices cling to the linen." Lynn looked at Eleanor's pristine, manicured hand resting on the edge of the range. The ginger she had used was a single slice, barely larger than a coin. The smell was clean, warm, and natural. To Eleanor, however, any scent that did not come from a lavender-scented aerosol can or a French perfume bottle was an invasive foreign element that threatened the sterile purity of her home. Lynn calculated the emotional cost of the moment. For years, she would have immediately apologized, turned off the burner, discarded the porridge, and prepared the organic oatmeal Eleanor preferred, swallowing her own silent resentment to keep the peace. But today, the math was different. The photos of the trust document were already in California. The legal counter-strategy was already being constructed. Every hour she kept Eleanor feeling secure, comfortable, and in control was an hour closer to the day she would leave. Her compliance was no longer a sign of submission. It was a tactical screen. "I will open the window to let the draft clear the air," Lynn said, her voice quiet and polite. "Thank you, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her smile returning, bright and empty. "We just want the house to feel fresh. It is so important when we have guests." Lynn walked to the kitchen window. She turned the brass latch, the metal cold and stiff in her hand, and pushed the heavy glass pane outward. A sudden, sharp blast of cold Tuesday morning air rushed into the kitchen, smelling of frost, dry leaves, and damp pine. It cut through the warm, heavy steam of the sesame oil and the lavender perfume, clearing the room in a single, silent sweep. Lynn stood by the open window, watching the white plume of steam from the porridge rise into the gray sky, vanishing completely over the neighbor's fence. She watched it go, a quiet, cold smile touching the corners of her mouth, as she realized how easily things could disappear when the wind finally shifted. The walk-in closet in the guest bedroom on the second floor was a deep, narrow space that smelled of cedar shavings, lavender sachets, and the musty, dry scent of wool blankets that had not been unpacked in years. It was a room Eleanor rarely entered, reserving it only for occasional holiday guests. Lynn knelt on the plush carpet in the furthest corner of the closet, her knees pressed against the floor. She reached behind a stack of heavy, vacuum-sealed winter duvets and pulled out a small gray steel lockbox. She took the small brass key from her apron pocket, inserted it into the lock, and turned it. The metal mechanism released with a quiet, oily click. Inside the box lay her most valuable possessions, documents she had spent the last 2 years quietly securing. She reached in and pulled out a thick, clear plastic sleeve. Inside was her green card, her Vietnamese passport, Leo's birth certificate, and a small blue booklet, Leo's Vietnamese passport. Lynn had applied for Leo's dual citizenship at the consulate in San Francisco during a brief trip to visit her sister 18 months ago. Thomas had thought the trip was merely a sisterly vacation, entirely unaware that Lynn had spent 3 hours in a sterile consulate office signing papers and presenting Leo's birth records. Thomas had insisted Leo only needed his American passport. "My son doesn't need foreign papers, Lynn," he had said at the time, his voice carrying that casual, arrogant dismissiveness she knew so well. "He is an American. He is a Whitford." Lynn smoothed her thumb over the soft plastic cover of Leo's Vietnamese passport. She felt the cool, textured emblem of the golden lotus. This passport was her shield. It was a document the Whitford family could not easily track or freeze through an American court order, a private back door to her home country. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her white wireless earbud, and pressed it deep into her left ear canal. She opened her secure messaging application. A new 3-minute voice memo from her sister's attorney contact, Sarah, was waiting. Lynn tapped play. The attorney's voice was low, professional, and slightly muffled, carrying the sharp, efficient tone of someone who spent her days navigating domestic traps. "Lynn, I reviewed the geographical restriction in the trust," Sarah's voice said in her ear. "It is highly aggressive, but it has a major vulnerability. The trustees can only file for emergency custody in New York if they can prove you have unilaterally relocated the child permanently. If you simply leave the state for a temporary vacation, they cannot trigger the emergency clause immediately without looking unreasonable to a judge. Your goal is to physically get Leo out of New York jurisdiction before they suspect anything. Once you are in California, we can file a protective petition for temporary custody under California's jurisdiction, citing your independent means of support. But you must not let them know you are leaving permanently. The departure must look entirely routine. Lynn listened, her hand gripping the edge of Leo's passport. The cool plastic crinkled slightly under her fingers. She sat in the dark closet, her mind working with a cold, mathematical precision. She began to calculate the timeline. Next Tuesday, Thomas was scheduled to fly to Chicago for a 3-day corporate deposition. Eleanor was attending her regional bridge tournament in New Jersey that same weekend, leaving early Friday morning and returning Sunday night. Richard would be alone in the house, but Richard spent his weekends almost entirely at the country club, leaving for the golf course at sunrise and returning long after dark. A 72-hour window. If she booked a flight for next Friday morning, she would have a 3-day head start before Thomas returned from Chicago or Eleanor came back from New Jersey. She could tell Thomas she was taking Leo to California for a 5-day trip to visit her sister Trang, who was struggling with postpartum depression. Thomas would complain about the cost of the last-minute ticket, but he would not suspect a permanent departure. He would view it as a minor inconvenience, a temporary disruption of his routine. She would pack only 2 suitcases, leaving the rest of her clothes hanging in the master closet, her vanity table undisturbed, her favorite blue ceramic mug sitting in the cupboard. To anyone looking at the house, it would appear as though she were simply stepping out for a short visit. Lynn felt a sudden, sharp chill run through her, but it was not the cold of the drafty closet. It was the realization of the risk. If she failed, if Eleanor found the lockbox or Thomas saw the flight confirmation on her laptop, they would instantly trigger the trust's emergency clause. They would paint her in court as an international flight risk, strip her of her parental rights, and lock her out of her son's life forever. She had to be perfect. Every movement, every conversation, every polite smile had to be absolutely seamless over the next 7 days. Lynn turned off the voice memo, deleted the audio file from her phone, and cleared the secure folder. She placed the plastic sleeve back into the steel box, closed the lid, and turned the brass key until the lock clicked. She slid the box deep behind the vacuum-sealed winter duvets, making sure the plastic wrap fell back over it exactly as it had before. She stood up, her knees popping slightly in the quiet guest room. She smoothed the front of her dress, her hands steady. From downstairs, the heavy mechanical grumble of the garage door opener began to vibrate through the walls. Eleanor was back from her hair appointment. Lynn walked out of the guest room, her face calm and her posture relaxed, ready to step back onto the stage. She was no longer just a wife trying to survive the quiet cruelty of her in-laws. She was a silent architect, and the countdown to her escape had officially begun. The sharp, clean thwack of the chef's knife slicing through a crisp Honeycrisp apple was the only sound in the kitchen at 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon. Lynn stood at the cutting board, her movements slow and deliberate. She cut the apple into thin, uniform wedges, carefully removing the dark seeds and the fibrous core. The sweet, slightly acidic scent of the fresh fruit rose from the board, a clean, natural aroma that temporarily masked the lingering lavender polish from the morning. The cool, watery juice of the apple coated her fingertips, sticky and sweet. Leo sat in his high chair nearby, his small hands reaching out, his eyes fixed on the bright red skin of the fruit. Lynn handed him a slice. He took a happy, wet bite, the quiet crunch of his chewing filling the small space between them. The soft rustle of silk sounded from the doorway as Eleanor entered. Her hair was perfectly coiffed from her morning appointment, a stiff, immaculate bob that looked as though it had been carved from wood. She carried her heavy, leather-bound planner under her arm. With a soft, heavy slap, Eleanor laid the planner open on the marble kitchen island. She pulled her gold-plated fountain pen from her pocket and clicked the cap off. "Lynn, dear," Eleanor said, her voice bright and efficient, "let us look at next week's schedule. It is going to be incredibly busy, and we must make sure our calendars are perfectly aligned." Lynn kept her eyes on the cutting board, slicing another wedge of the apple. "Of course, Eleanor." Eleanor flipped through the heavy parchment pages of her planner, her pen hovering over the entries. "Now, Thomas leaves for his Chicago deposition on Tuesday morning," she said, her pen tapping the page. "He will be gone until Friday night. And my regional bridge tournament in New Jersey starts on Friday morning. I will need to leave the house by 7 in the morning on Friday to beat the highway traffic." Lynn's hand stayed perfectly still, the blade of the knife resting lightly against the white flesh of the apple. Her heart did not speed up. Her breath remained slow and even. But in her mind, she was writing down the exact coordinates of her window. Thomas leaving on Tuesday, Eleanor leaving on Friday at 7 in the morning. Richard would be at his golf club by 7:30, as he always was on Friday mornings, to secure his preferred tea time. The house would be completely empty by 7:30. "Since the house will be mostly quiet next Friday," Eleanor continued, her voice carrying that pleasant, authoritative lilt, "I think it is the absolute perfect time to have the carpets in the living room and the dining room deep steam cleaned. I am going to schedule the service for Friday morning at 9. Eleanor looked up from her planner, her eyes scanning Lynn's face for any reaction. "You will need to be here to let the cleaners in, sweetheart. You must watch over them to make sure they don't scuff the baseboards, and then stay until they are completely finished. It should take about 3 hours. It will be so wonderful to have the carpets fresh before the Autumn Garden Club luncheon." Lynn calculated the space. Eleanor was setting a domestic anchor. By scheduling a carpet cleaning service that required Lynn's physical presence at 9 on Friday morning, she was binding her to the house. If Lynn objected, if she said she was planning to take Leo to California to visit her sister next Friday, Eleanor would look surprised. She would ask why Thomas had not mentioned it, complain about the cost of last-minute flights, and suggest another weekend. She would pressure Thomas, and Thomas would tell Lynn to postpone the trip. The window would slam shut. She had to agree. She had to let Eleanor believe the anchor was secure. But she also had to calculate the arrival of the cleaners. If the service was scheduled for 9 in the morning, and she and Leo left the house at 6:30, the house would be empty when the cleaners arrived. At 9 o'clock, the cleaners would ring the bell. They would find the doors locked. They would call the house phone, then Eleanor's cell phone. Eleanor would be on the highway to New Jersey. It would take her time to check her voicemail, time to call Thomas, and time to realize that Lynn and Leo were not there. By the time anyone realized the house was empty, Lynn and Leo would already be boarding their flight at John F. Kennedy International Airport, their bags checked, their boarding passes scanned. Lynn turned to Eleanor, her expression calm, polite,
and entirely empty of resistance. "That works perfectly, Eleanor," Lynn said, her voice smooth and sweet. "The carpets could really use the cleaning. I will make sure the furniture is moved back and the rooms are ready for them." "Oh, thank you, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her face lighting up with a warm, relieved smile as she scribbled a note in her planner with her gold pen. "It is so wonderful when we can coordinate these things without any fuss. It makes everything run so much smoother." Lynn handed the final slice of apple to Leo. He took it with a happy squeak, his small fingers sticky with juice. "Yes," Lynn said, her voice quiet as she wiped her hands on a clean kitchen towel. "It really does." She looked at the elegant, gold-trimmed planner on the counter. Eleanor sat there, smiling, completely satisfied with her own organization, entirely unaware that the schedule she had just written down was not a list of domestic chores. It was the exact flight plan for her grandson's permanent departure, and she had just handed Lynn the keys to the gate. The cold tap water ran over Lynn's fingers in a steady, freezing stream as she stood at the kitchen sink on Wednesday morning. It was her 34th birthday. Her phone, sitting silent on the quartz island, had only 2 notifications: a warm late-night text from her sister Trang in Da Nang, and an automated email from her dentist's office offering a generic card. Thomas had left for the office at 7 without a word, his mind entirely consumed by the upcoming Chicago trip, and Eleanor had not mentioned the date. Lynn did not expect them to remember. To the Whitford family, milestones were only worth celebrating if they could be turned into public social events. Her birthday, quiet and private, was an invisible blip on their elegant, crowded calendar. Lynn focused on her physical routine. She was peeling 6 hard-boiled eggs, her fingers working with a slow, meticulous precision. The delicate, wet crackle of the eggshells sounded sharp in the quiet kitchen. She slipped her thumb under the thin, transparent membrane, peeling the shell away in clean, large, curved pieces to reveal the smooth, pristine white surface of the egg beneath. She was preparing thit co tau, a traditional Vietnamese braised pork belly dish with eggs. It was a rich, comforting food, the very dish her mother used to make for her every year in Da Nang. In a house that constantly demanded she erase her own taste, her own culture, and her own voice, preparing this single dish was her quiet gift to herself. She set the peeled eggs in a ceramic bowl and turned to the stove. She placed a heavy stainless steel pot on the gas burner. She added a spoonful of sugar and a splash of water, watching the crystals slowly melt and bubble under the blue flame. She did not look away. The sugar turned from a pale yellow to a deep, warm amber, and finally to a dark, glossy mahogany caramel. She added the thick chunks of pork belly, garlic, and a generous splash of fish sauce. An immediate, intense plume of steam rose from the pot, hot and heavy, carrying the deep, savory sweet and sharp aroma of the fermented sauce. To Lynn, the smell was the scent of warmth, of safety, of her mother's small kitchen, where the damp tropical air was always thick with the promise of family. It was a beautiful, complex smell. To the Whitford house, however, it was an offense. The front door opened and closed, and the soft, brisk click of Eleanor's designer heels sounded in the hallway.
Eleanor was dressed to go out, wearing a pristine, cream-colored trench coat, her leather handbag resting on her forearm. She stopped dead in her tracks as she reached the kitchen threshold. Her face instantly tightened, her nostrils flaring slightly as she took in the air. "Lynn?" Eleanor said, her voice carrying a tight, forced politeness that could not entirely hide her deep displeasure. "Good morning, dear. What is that smell? Is everything all right in here?" "Good morning, Eleanor," Lynn said, keeping her voice calm and level as she stirred the pork, coating the meat in the dark caramel. "I am making a traditional braised pork dish." Eleanor walked closer, but she kept her distance from the stove, as if the rising steam might stain her cream-colored coat. She looked into the pot, her mouth forming a thin, hard line. "Oh dear," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into that familiar, disappointed tone. "It is so pungent, sweetheart. Is that fish sauce? Richard is always so incredibly sensitive to that particular fermented odor. It lingers so terribly, you know." Lynn adjusted the heat, turning the flame down to a low simmer. "The exhaust fan is on high, Eleanor. The air should clear soon." "Yes, but with the garden club planning luncheon tomorrow," Eleanor said, her tone carrying a sudden, sharp edge of panic. "We really can't have the house smelling so heavy, dear. The ladies are arriving at noon. If that aroma gets into the linen drapes in the dining room, the professional cleaners will have to come back, and we simply don't have the time." "Could you perhaps put a lid on it and keep the heat very low?" Lynn looked at the dark, bubbling pork belly. The caramel was rich, and the eggs were just beginning to absorb the golden brown color of the sauce. She calculated the emotional weight of the moment. She could tell Eleanor that it was her birthday, that this single pot of food was her only celebration, her only connection to her family and her home, on a day when everyone in this house had forgotten her. If she spoke, Eleanor would put on a grand theatrical display of guilt. She would offer to take Lynn to a bland, expensive local bistro for a lunch Lynn did not want, but she would still insist on discarding the pork to save her drapes. The performative pity of her mother-in-law was more exhausting than her neglect. "I will put the lid on," Lynn said, her voice flat and polite. "Thank you, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her face immediately relaxing into that warm, empty smile. "We just have to be mindful of the shared space. It is all about consideration, really. Have a lovely afternoon, dear. I must run to the linen boutique before the traffic gets bad." Eleanor reached out, her paper-thin, dry hand patting Lynn's forearm in a quick, dismissive gesture of approval, before she turned and walked out of the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply down the hallway. Lynn stood by the stove. She picked up the heavy glass lid and placed it firmly on top of the pot. The bubbling sound of the pork became muffled, a low, wet whisper behind the glass. The sweet, dark steam was instantly sealed away, trapped inside the steel container, unable to escape into the pristine, cold air of the kitchen. Lynn leaned her hands against the edge of the quartz counter, her head bowed as she watched the grease and condensation collect on the inside of the glass lid, dripping slowly back down into the dark sauce. They wanted her invisible. They wanted her culture, her memories, and her small joys sealed tightly behind glass where they could never threaten the sterile perfection of their world. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the oven door. The countdown to Friday was ticking, and this small, sealed pot of food was the last boundary she would ever allow them to cross. At 2:00 in the afternoon, the nursery was silent, and Leo was finally fast asleep. Lynn walked down the stairs, her steps light and quiet on the hardwood. Her stomach rumbled. She had not eaten since her small bowl of rice at 7 in the morning, and the thought of her birthday pork belly, sweet, savory, and rich with caramel, was a warm, grounding anticipation in her mind. She stepped into the kitchen. The air in the room was cold. The sliding glass door leading to the patio was cracked open 3 inches, letting in a sharp, freezing draft that rustled the edges of the linen curtains. The warm, rich scent of the ginger and caramelized fish sauce was entirely gone. In its place hung a thick, artificial cloud of vanilla and lavender aerosol spray, a cloying chemical sweetness that immediately made her throat itch and her eyes water. Lynn walked to the stove. The burner was cold. The heavy stainless steel pot was no longer there. She turned to the sink. The pot sat in the stainless steel basin, filled to the brim with cold, greasy, gray dishwater. A thick layer of white soap suds sat on the surface, already beginning to pop and dissolve, leaving a greasy ring around the metal. The pot was completely empty. Lynn stood frozen for a second, her hands hanging at her sides. She slowly reached down and opened the heavy trash cabinet beneath the quartz counter. She slid the drawer out. Inside the black plastic liner, sitting directly on top of the morning's coffee grounds, discarded paper towels, and soggy eggshells, was her thete kotau, the thick, tender chunks of pork belly, the deep mahogany-colored eggs she had peeled so carefully, and the rich, glossy caramel sauce were smeared against the plastic and the trash. The dish was ruined, covered in grease and waste, discarded like common table scraps. The rustle of paper sounded from the dining room. Eleanor was sitting at the cherry wood table, her gold pen in hand, as she reviewed a printed list of flower arrangements for the garden club luncheon. She looked up, her face immediately shifting into a warm, soft expression of maternal concern as she saw Lynn standing by the counter. "Oh, Lynn, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice gentle, melodic, and entirely empty of malice. "I am so glad you are down. I had to have Richard help me clear the kitchen out." Lynn stood by the trash cabinet. She did not close it. The smell of the chemical lavender spray and the sweet, ruined pork rose from the drawer. "My pork is in the trash, Eleanor," Lynn said. Her voice was flat, carrying no anger, no tears, no tremor. "Yes, dear," Eleanor said, putting her gold pen down on the table. She sighed softly, a little sound of polite exhaustion. "I am so sorry, but that smell! It was simply rising up the vents into the guest bedrooms. With the ladies arriving tomorrow at noon, I just couldn't risk the drapes and the carpets absorbing it. It is so terribly difficult to get that fermented odor out of the fabrics once it settles, and Richard's sinuses were already acting up. It really is for the best, sweetheart."
Eleanor spoke with the absolute calm certainty of a woman who believed she had done a necessary, helpful chore. She had not thrown away her daughter-in-law's birthday lunch out of cruelty. She had done it out of expediency, out of a total, polite disregard for anything that did not fit the sterile, insular purity of her world. To Eleanor, the food was not a memory, a culture, or a gift. It was a nuisance, a smelly obstacle to a successful garden club planning luncheon. "We can easily have Thomas bring you home a lovely chicken salad from the deli when he finishes his meetings," Eleanor added, offering a warm, generous smile. "Or I can order a nice bistro wrap for you. We want to make sure you are taken care of, dear." Lynn looked at her mother-in-law. Eleanor sat there, immaculate in her soft, cream-colored sweater, her diamond earrings catching the pale afternoon light, completely untouched by the quiet destruction she had just caused. Lynn calculated the energy of the moment. If she screamed, if she let the hot, burning tears slip down her face, if she told Eleanor that today was her 34th birthday and that pot of food was her only connection to her home and her mother, Eleanor would act shocked. She would put on a grand theatrical display of guilt, perhaps even cry herself, claiming she had no idea. She would pressure Thomas, and Thomas would tell Lynn she was being overly sensitive and dramatic, that his mother was only trying to keep the house clean for her guests. They would use her pain to label her as difficult, emotional, and unstable. They would watch her more closely. She could not afford to let them see her. She needed them to believe she was completely subdued, that she had accepted her place as the silent, invisible buffer who would always bow to their convenience. Lynn quietly slid the trash drawer shut. It met the cabinet frame with a soft, cushioned click, sealing the ruined pork belly away in the dark. "No, thank you, Eleanor," Lynn said, her voice smooth, empty, and entirely polite. "I am not hungry." "Are you sure, sweetheart?" Eleanor asked, her eyes already drifting back down to her list of flower arrangements. "It is no trouble at all to order the salad." "I am sure," Lynn said. She walked to the sink. She turned on the hot water, watching the steam rise, smelling the sharp, chemical lemon soap. She picked up the sponge and began to scrub the empty stainless steel pot, her fingers moving in steady, rhythmic circles through the cold, greasy suds. The heavy metal of the pot scraped against the sink, a harsh, repeating sound that filled the quiet kitchen. Lynn felt nothing. The last thin thread of emotional connection she had kept to this family, the small, desperate hope that they might one day see her as a human being, was completely dead. She scrubbed the pot until the steel was raw, bright, and sterile, matching the cold, empty house around her. There were only 9 days left until next Friday. She would play her part perfectly. She would smile, she would cook, and she would remain invisible until the exact moment she vanished, leaving them with nothing but their pristine, spotless dining room and a silence they would never be able to fill. The quiet, dry scrape of the plastic scoop against the interior of the coffee canister was a hollow, repeating sound in the dark kitchen. It was 8 o'clock on Wednesday evening. Lynn stood at the counter, preparing the automatic drip coffee maker for the following morning, ensuring that Richard and Eleanor's fresh brew would be ready at precisely 6:30 without either of them having to touch a button.
She worked by the light of the range hood. The rest of the kitchen was dark, casting long, thin shadows across the white quartz island and the polished cherrywood cabinets. She picked up a white paper filter, the dry, stiff texture rustling softly in her hands. She opened the basket, laid the filter inside, and flattened the edges with her fingertips. She measured out exactly 4 scoops of the dark, bitter decaf grounds Eleanor preferred for her morning cup. The dusty, roasted aroma rose from the basket, a dry, sterile scent that carried no warmth. Thomas sat at the kitchen island, his legs crossed, his broad shoulders hunched over his laptop as he reviewed the final documents for his Chicago deposition. A glass of ice water sat near his elbow, the condensation slowly dripping down the glass and forming a small, clear pool on the quartz. Suddenly, a sharp, high-pitched ding sounded from his phone, which lay face up on the counter. The screen lit up with a bright blue glare, displaying a calendar notification. Thomas glanced at the screen, his thumb pausing over his trackpad. He blinked, staring at the notification for several long seconds. A sudden, sheepish look crossed his face, his jaw loosening as he looked up at Lynn's back. "Oh," he said, his voice carrying a dry, hurried chuckle. "Lynn, is it the 14th today? It is your birthday, isn't it?" Lynn did not stop filling the water reservoir. She picked up the heavy glass carafe, her movements smooth and unbroken, and poured the cold tap water into the back of the machine. "Yes," she said. "Man, I am so sorry," Thomas said, rubbing the back of his neck, his tone dropping into that familiar, self-excusing whine he used whenever he had neglected his responsibilities. "This Chicago merger preparation has completely wiped me out. I have been staring at spreadsheets since 7 this morning, and my brain is just mush. I completely lost track of the date." Lynn set the empty glass carafe back onto the heating plate. It met the burner with a soft, hollow clink. She closed the lid of the coffee maker. "It is fine, Thomas," she said, her voice flat and entirely devoid of emotion. "No, it's not," he said, though his posture immediately relaxed, his guilt easily dismissed now that he had acknowledged the mistake. "We will definitely celebrate when I get back from Chicago next weekend, okay? I will have Mom watch Leo for a night, and we can go to that new Italian place downtown, the one with the private booths. How does that sound?" "It sounds fine," Lynn said. "And in the meantime," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his leather wallet, he slid a gold credit card across the polished quartz island. "Why don't you buy yourself something nice on Amazon tonight? Treat yourself, sweetheart. Just use the card." Lynn looked at the gold card lying on the cold quartz. The yellow light from the range hood reflected off the polished metal edge. She calculated the math of the moment. Her sister's attorney contact in California had advised her to make her departure look as routine as possible. If she purchased the one-way flights to San Francisco using her own hidden private bank account, the sudden drop in her personal funds would leave her with very little emergency cash once she landed. But Thomas had just handed her his primary credit card, the one linked to his corporate account, with an automatic monthly payment system he rarely audited. If she booked the flights tonight, the charge would show up simply as an airline purchase. Next week, when she told Thomas she was taking Leo to visit her sister Trang for a few days to help with the new baby, he would assume the charge was for her round-trip ticket. He would not look closely enough to see that she had purchased 2 one-way tickets. He would not see that she had no intention of ever returning. Lynn reached out, her fingers still slightly dry from the dishwater, touched the cold metal of the gold card. She picked it up. "Thank you, Thomas," Lynn said, her voice quiet, steady, and perfectly polite. "I will do that." "Great," Thomas said, his face immediately lighting up with relief as he turned his attention back to his laptop screen, his duty fully discharged through the simple transaction. "Just keep it reasonable, you know? We have the country club's quarterly dues coming up next week, and Richard was complaining about the landscaping bill today." "I will keep it very reasonable," Lynn said. She slid the gold card into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against the small brass key to her steel lockbox. She turned off the range hood light. The kitchen fell into complete darkness, save for the blinking green light of the internet router in the corner and the red standby indicator on the coffee maker. Lynn walked upstairs to the quiet bedroom. She sat on the edge of the unmade bed, her phone screen glowing in the dark as she opened the airline application. Her fingers moved rapidly, entering her details, Leo's details, and the number of Thomas's gold credit card. One way, New York to San Francisco, Friday morning, 8:30. She tapped the screen. The small circle spun for 3 seconds. Approved. A digital confirmation code appeared on the dark display, a neat sequence of letters and numbers that represented her freedom. Lynn turned off her phone and laid it face down on the nightstand. She lay back on the pillows, staring up at the dark ceiling, the silence of the room wrapping around her like a cold shroud. The catalyst had passed, the final line had been crossed, and they had crossed it with a polite smile, a discarded plate of food, and a gold credit card. They believed they had paid for her silence, that they could buy her compliance with the simple flick of a plastic card. But they did not know that they had just financed their own quiet ruin, and that in 9 days, the house they had built would fall into a silence they would never be able to break. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 6 on Friday morning. The house was quiet, filled with the heavy, cold gray light of early dawn. Lynn lay in bed, her eyes open, listening. At exactly 6:30, the soft rustle of Eleanor's trench coat and the light click of her house shoes sounded in the hallway. A few minutes later, the heavy thud of the garage door opened, followed by the low mechanical rumble of her SUV engine. Eleanor was leaving for her bridge tournament in New Jersey. The car backed down the driveway. The garage door closed with a final, echoing thud. Lynn sat up. She got out of bed, her bare feet finding the cold hardwood floor. She did not rush. She dressed Leo in a soft yellow cotton shirt, comfortable and worn, entirely free of starch. She zipped her 2 suitcases. She took the small steel lockbox from the guest closet, sliding it into her canvas tote bag. She walked down the stairs. She did not look back at the master bedroom, where Thomas's empty dresser sat. She did not look at the pristine cherry dining table. She walked out of the front door, the heavy oak lock clicking shut behind her. By 9 o'clock, the carpet cleaning van would pull into the driveway. They would find the house dark and silent. By then, Lynn and Leo were sitting in the terminal at the airport, watching the silver planes lift off into the gray New York sky. 6 months later, the dust had settled, but the silence in the Whitford estate was permanent. The legal battle had been swift and quiet, fought not with dramatic shouting, but with cold, documented facts. Sarah, the attorney in California, had filed for temporary custody the moment Lynn and Leo arrived in San Francisco. The geographical restriction in the trust fund had indeed been triggered,
forfeiting the family wealth for Leo. When Thomas had called her, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and utter bewilderment, he had threatened her with the loss of the money. "You threw away his future, Lynn. He will not have a dime of his inheritance. Do you know what you have done to him?" Lynn had listened to his voice through the phone speaker, sitting in her new, sunlit apartment in San Francisco. The air smelled of ginger, toasted sesame, and fresh jasmine tea. She looked at Leo, who was happily playing with wooden blocks on a warm rag rug. "My son has a mother who loves him," Lynn had said, her voice entirely calm and steady. "That is a future you cannot buy." She had hung up. She did not seek their money. She took a job as a senior translator for a medical firm, earning her own clean, independent salary. She did not need their gold cards. She did not need their country club memberships. The true consequence of their arrogance, however, did not arrive in a courtroom. It arrived in the quiet, empty spaces of their pristine house. Eleanor and Richard, realizing that the California courts would not enforce their New York trust restrictions to strip a mother of her child, were forced to accept the strict, supervised visitation rules. Since they refused to travel to California, claiming the West Coast was too chaotic, they were reduced to weekly 15-minute video calls. It was during these calls that the trap they had built snapped shut on them, completely and irreversibly. On a Tuesday evening, Eleanor sat in her pristine living room, her tablet propped up on the cherry wood coffee table. Richard sat beside her, his face looking older, the silver hair slightly thin. The screen connected, showing Leo sitting on Lynn's lap in their cozy, bright apartment. "My little prince," Eleanor cooed, her voice carrying that high, artificial sweetness she had used for years. "Hello, Leo. Say hello to Grandma. Look, Grandpa is here too." Leo, now nearly 3, looked at the screen. His dark eyes were intelligent, calm, and completely blank. He did not smile. He did not reach out to touch the screen. He looked at Eleanor as if she were a stranger on a television commercial. Lynn did not translate. She sat quietly behind him, her face calm. At home, she spoke only Vietnamese to her son. She had stopped speaking English entirely in their private spaces, reclaiming the language of her home, her mother, and her blood. Leo turned his head toward Lynn. He spoke rapidly, his voice high and bright, a stream of beautiful, fluent Vietnamese. "Me oi, con muốn ăn đào," he said, asking his mother for an apple. Lynn smiled, answering him in the same soft, musical language, nodding as she handed him a fresh slice. On the screen in New York, Eleanor's smile froze. Her eyes widened, a sudden cold panic washing over her face. She looked at Richard, then back at the screen. "Lynn?" Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly, the polite mask finally shattering. What is he saying?" "Tell him to speak English, dear. We cannot understand him. Richard, tell him to speak properly." Lynn looked directly into the camera. Her face was peaceful, carrying no anger, no triumph, only the absolute, unyielding weight of truth. "Leo only speaks Vietnamese at home, Eleanor," Lynn said, her English clear, quiet, and cold. "He does not understand you." But he is a Whitford," Eleanor cried, her voice cracking, her manicured fingers pressing against the edge of the screen. "He has to speak our language. We are his family." "You wanted me to erase my culture so the house would smell clean," Lynn said, her voice a low, steady whisper that filled the quiet New York living room. "You threw away my mother's food because you could not stand the smell. Now your grandson has no words for you. You wanted a clean house, Eleanor. Now you have one." Lynn tapped the screen. The call disconnected. The tablet went black, reflecting Eleanor's stunned, pale face in the empty, silent room. They were left with exactly what they had demanded: a spotless, pristine home, entirely free of foreign scents, free of noise, and free of the messy, vibrant life of the daughter-in-law they had tried so hard to erase. But the silence in their beautiful house was no longer a sign of elegance. It was a monument to their own isolation, a quiet, freezing cage they could never escape. If this story reminded you that family should never take love for granted, and that true dignity can never be bought or erased, you are not alone. It is a powerful reminder that the choices we make and the way we treat the people who serve us in silence always find a way to shape our own endings. What would you have done if you were in Lynn's position? Would you have stayed to protect the inheritance, or would you have chosen the freedom of your child's identity? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. If you enjoy deeply meaningful family dramas that explore resilience, second chances, and the quiet triumph of truth, please consider subscribing to the channel. Together, we will continue to share stories that remind us of what truly matters in this life. In the end, Eleanor and Richard kept their pristine dining room, but they lost the only voice that could have given their legacy any real meaning.